For the first 4 decades of the United States' existence, the presidency was a heavily guarded, elite institution. Early leaders like George Washington and John Adams designed the executive branch to project national unity and execute federal law, completely insulated from the turbulent impulses of the general public. During the so-called era of good feelings, power transferred smoothly between political factions. These transitions, however, were brokered by a small circle of established aristocrats in Washington, rather than the direct will of the voters. This chart shows the explosive growth of the American voting-eligible population. By the 1820s, a massive influx of newly enfranchised white male voters entered the system, demanding a direct voice in how the government was run. That demand collided with the political establishment in the election of 1824. Despite a clear populist favorite winning the popular vote, elite maneuvering in the House of Representatives handed the presidency to John Quincy Adams, an event critics immediately branded the corrupt bargain. The insulation of the executive branch had fractured. A rapidly expanding, intensely angry electorate now felt cut off from the levers of power, leaving a massive political vacuum waiting to be exploited. Andrew Jackson was born in the Waxhaws region. He had no wealth, no prestigious family name, and zero ties to the traditional Washington establishment. What he did have was a record of aggressive military success. In January 1815, Jackson led American forces to a staggering, entirely unexpected victory against the British at the Battle of New Orleans. He leveraged that battlefield fame, combined with his rugged frontier background, to position himself as the exact opposite of the aristocratic elite. He campaigned as the uncorrupted champion of the common man. This strategy successfully mobilized the newly enfranchised voters. In 1828, Jackson swept into the White House on a wave of popular revenge, dismantling the old political order and giving rise to the Democratic Party. The election of 1828 was a hostile takeover. Jackson tore down the elite machinery of the early republic and dragged the presidency directly into the hands of the electorate. Once in office, Jackson operated on a simple premise. Because he was the only federal official elected by the entire nation, the president alone was the direct voice of the people. He aimed that populist voice squarely at the second bank of the United States. The bank was a centralized financial institution that controlled the nation's credit and currency. Jackson saw it as an unconstitutional monopoly that enriched wealthy Eastern elites at the direct expense of rural farmers and laborers. To destroy it, Jackson bypassed Congress entirely. He weaponized the presidential veto to block the bank's recharter, starving it of federal deposits. By killing the national bank, Jackson proved that a chief executive, drawing power directly from the voting public, possessed the authority to single-handedly dictate the economic reality of the country. That executive authority was soon tested by a domestic political crisis. The 1828 Tariff of Abominations placed extremely high taxes on imported goods, severely straining the agricultural economy of the southern states. In response, politicians developed the theory of nullification, a constitutional claim that an individual state could simply ignore any federal law it decided was harmful. South Carolina put the theory into practice, attempting to nullify the tariff within its borders. This was a direct challenge to federal cohesion and to Jackson's mandate as the leader of the entire Union. Jackson responded with an uncompromising threat. He prepared to deploy the federal military straight into South Carolina, ready to use armed force against American citizens to execute federal law. The nullification crisis demonstrated that Jackson's populism relied on a rigid assertion of federal supremacy, backed entirely by the willingness to use military violence. The most devastating application of this unrestrained executive power arrived with the Indian Removal Act of 1830. Driven by white voters' hunger for agricultural land in the South, the administration used the will of the electoral majority to legally justify the forced displacement of Native American tribes from their ancestral homes. When the Supreme Court ruled in favor of tribal sovereignty, Jackson simply ignored the ruling. He refused to enforce the court's decision, relying on his massive popular base to shield him from institutional consequences. The act resulted in a catastrophic human toll. Tens of thousands of Native Americans were forced into a brutal death march known as the Trail of Tears. Thousands died from disease and starvation, a forced migration overseen with absolute impunity. An unbridled majoritarian presidency could legally enforce the violent removal of an entire population, completely unchecked by the courts or the legislature. By the time Andrew Jackson left office in 1837, the boundaries of the executive branch had been redrawn. He demonstrated that a president could bypass Congress, ignore the Supreme Court, and pull nearly invulnerable authority straight from the voting electorate. Jacksonian democracy left a complicated, dual legacy. It broke down the aristocratic barriers of the early republic to open political participation to the common man, while simultaneously institutionalizing unilateral and often destructive executive force. The original, insulated limits of the office were gone. In their place stood the majoritarian model, a blueprint that defines the awesome and dangerous power of the modern American presidency.